Welcome to the BJJ Mental Coach podcast. I'm your host, Gustavo Dantas, and today I have jiu-jitsu black belt Mike Piekarski. Mike graduated from Binghamton University in New York with a bachelor's degree, and during this time, he found MMA and began competing, eventually turning professional while competing Muay Thai and submission grappling. After he began his professional MMA career, he decided to shift his focus, return to school, and earn his doctorate in physical therapy. Upon completion of graduate school, Mike moved to Los Angeles and earned his black belt in jiu-jitsu and became a board-certified orthopedic clinical specialist by the American Physical Therapy Association. Today, you can find Dr. Kickass, is Dr._Kickass on Instagram, sharing his knowledge to over 30,000 followers. So Dr. Kickass, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. I was mentioning before that a good friend of mine that was a guest on episode 125, Greg McClarty from Control Physical Therapy in Scottsdale, Arizona. He is the one that told me to check it out. I wasn't familiar with the profile, so I started following. So pretty cool. A lot of good information. I'm gonna have the link too for everyone that would like to check it out. So awesome information, man. So let's talk a little bit about before your beginning of jiu-jitsu. Let's just talk about your Instagram. When did you start the profile and how did it actually come about?
So I think I started 4 or 5 years ago. And I remember it was very interesting because I was rolling with some people and I like using leg locks. I've always done leg locks, and I remember I went for like a straight ankle lock against, I think I was a brown belt at the time and I was going with a purple belt. He tapped super quick and he's like, "Oh, I don't play that leg stuff." I'm like, dude, this is a straight ankle lock. This is legal in like white belt kids divisions, And then I was like, it's interesting. I'm like, leg locks have this like stigma and people just don't really understand them, right? Because they think heel hooks and they think your knee's going to explode if you touch it. So that was kind of like what inspired me. I'm like, I'm just going to see what was going on. So I started doing some submission breakdowns of like, what's the difference between like a toe hold, a heel hook, an ankle lock. It was actually interesting because I first started and, I like Instagram doesn't make sense. Like you can put in so much work in and it doesn't get any traction. And then you can put a post where you put like no time in. And anyway, so I was actually getting to the point where I was kind of frustrated. I think I did it for like 2 months and I was literally about to stop. Like I was like, this is kind of a waste of my time. Like nobody's seeing it. And then the leg locker Instagram shared something. And then like overnight, like my followers doubled. And then from there, I was able to grow it. Cool. So it was kind of just like a unexpected thing that I never anticipated that it was going to expand to the degree that it has. And then I just, there was a point where I was just, a jiu-jitsu guy, like, I had all these injuries. And I remember like, I had no health insurance when I was competing in MMA, and I was always so freaked out. Like if I got an injury, like that's it, So I kind of wanted to use my Instagram as like a platform to kind of educate people like, hey, like this is kind of what's going on. Like, because this type of information didn't exist when I was coming up.
For sure. Now let's go back and to beginning of your martial arts journey. When did martial arts show up in your life?
So I found I had done like some Japanese jiu-jitsu when I was in high school. In hindsight, it wasn't really good. I think the one thing I took away is I learned how to do a proper break fall. But other than that, it didn't really show anything. I had a knee injury when I was a teenager. I was just like, I kind of like wrestling around with a friend and my kneecap slid out of place. So, and it kept happening. So I ended up needing surgery. So that was kind of the end of my Japanese jiu-jitsu. Like I think I did like 4 months with it and then I needed knee surgery. So I had to stop. The knee surgery that I had is something called a lateral release. And the idea was that they think that the structures on the outside of their knee were pulling my kneecap out of place. So they kind of trimmed it. They don't really do that surgery anymore because the outcomes aren't great. Like I still have a lot of quad weakness that I've been able to deal with since I was a teenager. So, fast forward about 2 years, now I'm in college and I was like, all right, well, my knee's feeling good enough. I want to try to get back into a martial art. And I found a Brazilian jiu-jitsu group. And I was like, so it was taught by a white belt. It was just like, just a whole bunch of kids on a mat. But
And
I
what
was
year
like,
was that?
that was like 2005. So, so like, I'd done some Japanese jiu-jitsu. I'm like, well, Japanese Brazilian jiu-jitsu might be similar. I remember the first day I go, I'm like, I finally feel like I'm learning martial arts. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You like after like I'm like everything that I learned previous was a complete waste of time. So again, like the instructor was a white belt, but again, they did jiu-jitsu. Eventually, during my breaks, I found a purple belt who was about half an hour away from me. So during winter break and summer break, I started training with him. Before I went back in 2006, before I was going to go back to college, I ended up getting my blue belt. So then I ended up started teaching in college. And that was just, I mean, you know how jiu-jitsu is, like you find it and fall in love with it. And you're like, I want to do this for the rest of my life.
Yeah. So what point is that around that time that you realize that, you know what, I'm going to be doing this for a long time? And right now, do you work with a lot of athletes or not necessarily just
I work with I'd work with anyone, but obviously my specialty is working with athletes, especially jiu-jitsu athletes, just because I think there's very few people that have my degree of martial art experience and physical therapy experience. Like there's people who do jiu-jitsu very, very casually. So they kind of understand it, but they're usually like white or blue belt. I mean, there are the few exception of people that are more. But a lot of times people come to me, they're like, well, I want to work with you because I understand exactly what they want to get back to. When they go to see their physician and they're like, well, how do you hurt your knee? Well, I went for a triangle, my knee popped. They're like, well, what does that mean? Why would that happen? And I can understand. I'm like, okay, this makes sense. I understand it, And then from a physical therapy standpoint, like let's say you have an injury, like I have a very clear understanding, like you need to go do this, then this, then this, and then we can get you back. A lot of times when you go see your physician, there's that general advice, which is, all right, I want you to lay off your injury. I want you to ice it and then go back in 6 months or 6 weeks. But what does that mean? Essentially what they're doing is they don't understand the activity. So they're like, well, if I tell you to do nothing, most likely you won't re-injure it. I mean, how many jiu-jitsu people do you know? They're like, so the class before, they popped their elbow and like, how's your elbow? It's fine. It just popped a few times. And they're like, they stick their hand into their belt, and I have a little bit better understanding of, okay, what aspect of jiu-jitsu can you still do? Or is it time you actually do need to rest? And that kind of understanding.
Got it.
Yeah.
So what point of your journey you started to get like real, I don't know if it was since the beginning that you start to get the correlation of grappling and submissions and like to start like really working together?
So I think it wasn't until I actually had graduated. So, I at one point, my original plan was to open a gym. But I really didn't want to live in upstate New York because it's not really a very desirable area. And I was like, well, what else could I do? And I was looking at personal training, but at the time I didn't have the kind of that social aspect of like, if you're a personal trainer, essentially you're selling yourself, right? So, and then that's when I was looking into physical therapy and I didn't really want to go back to school. And I started applying for physical therapy assistant jobs. And then I find out later that that's actually like a separate license and degree. And then I decided, maybe I want to go back to school, even though I didn't want to accrue debt. So I'm in school and I really didn't put them together, right? It wasn't until I graduated when I was like, oh, I can actually work with jiu-jitsu athletes. And, and then I realized that there really wasn't a lot of information about how to treat the jiu-jitsu athlete or the kickboxer or the MMA fighter. And then, the more that I started to, put two together, I realized that I had this very specialized niche that very few people could fill.
Yeah, and this, man, what you mentioned is really, it's huge of having someone that understands like what is going on, especially grappling wise, because as you mentioned, people are, all right, stop training when they don't say like you should never grapple again. That's one of those too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, like, I think I was a white belt, and of course I tap late to an arm bar, my elbow pops. I go see, I think this was when I was in college, and I go see like the school physician, and they're like, they're asking me questions. They're like, yeah, like, I think you should stop. I'm like, wait, I should stop? They're like, yeah, like, it doesn't sound like it's good. I'm like, but generally what happens if you go to a physician and they say, all right, this is what happened, I think you should stop martial arts, like, you're just going to find somebody else. Like, you're like, this person clearly doesn't understand sports and athletics. I'm going to find somebody else. I'm not going to listen to that person, So it just, like I said, it's crazy how much the sport is growing. So obviously I feel that, combat sports are becoming much more mainstream, but still, like, on the medical aspect, that's still lacking quite a bit.
It's interesting. When I look back into my journey, I'll be 47 in a couple of weeks. And I remember when I started training at 14. So when I was 15, around that time, I think I remember it's around the first time I ever got my arm popped in training, right? So I at home, I'm like, hey mom, this happened, this and that. So she is concerned, takes me to a clinic. They look and say, okay, ice, ibuprofen, and don't do anything for 2 weeks or whatever. Yeah. And then whenever it happened again, and then told my mom, and then the same thing happened, like, do this. By the third time, I'm not telling my mom, and I'm not going there, so, and I don't know if I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, but I just build it in, like, something like, unless it's really bad, I'll tell her. If not, I'll just deal with it.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say that, because I think that's a common misconception with a lot of grapplers. For the most part, like, what we do, if you think about it, like, we take our joints and we bend them in ways they're not supposed to go. Like, even if, like, we tap, like, it's still probably, jiu-jitsu probably still isn't great for our body, right? And, like, I'm guilty of this too. Be like, oh, my ankle popped, I'm good to go. But here's the thing is, that pop was something. Like, it wasn't nothing. It might not be bad enough that you need to see a medical professional, but sometimes it is, and that's kind of like where, one of the roles that I feel is, like, when do you actually need to see somebody and when do you don't, right? Because I think, I was thinking about this. If you take, like, a competitor, is as time goes on, they're getting more experience, they're getting better at technical level, but their body's starting to deteriorate, right? Because they start to accumulate all of these chronic injuries. And even for me, with what I know, like, I still have some chronic injuries of things that, like, even with my experience, I can't get 100%, but I can understand how to compensate. But that starts to add up. And that's usually when someone has to retire, because they can't train the way that they need to be able to compete, right? So here's the thing is, you get your elbow popped once, twice, but maybe after a while, now your elbow is a little bit loose, and now it's easier for it to pop. Then what happens is, then you start to develop these changes in your elbow. I'm sure you've seen a lot of black belts that can't straighten their elbow because they've had their elbows popped too much. And at some point you wait too long, like, that's not a physical therapy thing. Like, that's a surgery thing where they have to, like, clean out the elbow, where you actually get these little osteophytic changes into the bone, So, I mean, that's just the most common chronic injury I see in black belts. They're like, I can't straighten my elbow anymore. I'm like, that's not a good thing.
Yeah. And it's interesting to mention about that because some people have, like, man, I don't know, my knees, my shoulders, my gig is elbows. I don't know what the problem is, but I had surgery before. I dislocated 3 times. I broke it twice, so that's something that, over time I abused. Yeah. And as you get older, you start to kind of, like, understanding. But yeah, one of the things too I want you to talk about is this, you mentioned about fairly young athletes putting a lot of load into their body. One example, I have one of my students, Orlando Motedo. He got his school. He's in Hawaii now, in Kona, and he's just coming back from his back was, like, really wrecked for 4 months. And this guy, for him not to train, it needs to be like he's officially injured, But I've been telling him for a long time, like, dude, you need to calm down, and, like, training way too much load. And then he was mentioned the day that he hurt, like, that was the last set I should have done. I was like, do you think the last set did it? You know what I mean? You've been putting loads of, like, strength and conditioning and getting upside down and getting stacked, for, like, over 10 years, like 13 years. at some point the bill will come, and oftentimes expensive. You know what I mean? Expensive to your
Absolutely.
body. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what do you recommend for people who are listening and they kind of just get their like, I'm tough mentality, keep grinding no matter what? Da, 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 da. What do you think?
Well, I mean, obviously you have to kind of respect injuries, and you have to think that there's like, okay, so
And have athletes and hobbyists too, you know, that
yeah,
differs too.
you have to think that you have to look at your jiu-jitsu game and what you're doing, and is your body ready for what you're doing? And I think inverting is a perfect example. Is, do you need to invert to be good at jiu-jitsu? You don't. Does everyone have the spine where they should be inverting? Meaning, there's a lot of people that are really stiff, is maybe that they shouldn't be doing it. Because if you think about it, when you invert, if you do like a Granby roll, you're really not rolling over your neck, you're rolling over your shoulders. But if your neck doesn't go all the way down, you're going to load that neck, right? So now you try to invert rolling under somebody, and then they drop their weight down. Now you're just putting a lot of stress on their neck because you don't have the proper mobility. Then you could look at like the lumbar spine or the low back too. Same thing. Like you do stuff, and I'm guilty of this too. Like I can, wrap someone up in a triangle and I let them stack me. And I'm like, I don't really care. But now I'm in my mid 30s, and now sometimes I care when people do that. Like, it's just like one of those points. Like it wasn't that, just like you said, it wasn't that last time that did it, is over and over and over again. So I think it's really important for people to kind of like look at their game and see, should they be doing what they're doing, right? Because if you don't have the mobility to do, like, so again, in addition to like the spine, you can look at a lot of guard. I think that jiu-jitsu requires abnormal hip mobility. Just if you want to have an effective open guard, like you play a lasso guard, spider guard, triangles, like your hips need to be able to move in a lot of different positions. You also have to think like a lot of passes about killing those hips. So a lot of times you have to be kind of strong in these kind of weird ranges, right? Because you need to be able to move people. So first, look at your game. Should you be doing the game that you're playing? Second, I think it's really important for people to include some kind of strength, conditioning, and mobility routine into their life, right? Because your jiu-jitsu is physical, but your body doesn't care that you want to do jiu-jitsu. Is what are you doing to maintain your body so that you can also do jiu-jitsu? If you look at the literature, the thing that's the most important aspect of injury prevention, it's strength training in some capacity. Right. I think stretching doesn't get a good, isn't really encouraged as much in literature, but in my opinion, it's, if you take stretching, like when people just stretch after class, they're just kind of stretching arbitrary aspects of their body, not necessarily things that they need to be doing for jiu-jitsu. Like, are they doing hip stretches? Are they doing different shoulder stretches? Usually when you watch people stretch, they kind of like stretch their hamstring. I'm like, do you really need to be doing that? And again, that comes with an assessment. So, if you don't have the mobility to do the game that you want, you need to be able to get that. Once you have the adequate mobility to handle all of the activities you need to do within jiu-jitsu, that's when I would do a lot of strength and conditioning. Again, make sure you're strong in these positions. Conditioning is important. I mean, like, I'm sure you've been there, just like the injury you were talking about. How many times do people get hurt on that last round, right? Because when you're fatigued, you're more prone to get hurt because now you're weak, right? So I think it's important to have adequate, conditioning. And again, it all comes down to time, whether you're a competitor or a hobbyist. Not everyone has the time, but I would say from a conditioning standpoint that just rolling isn't always the best thing to maintain conditioning, right? Like it just comes down to, look at that person. Do they need more conditioning, strength, and mobility? I won't know until I do an assessment. But I think that everyone should include some aspect of those things in their daily routine.
Got it. I listened recently, someone saying, from what you're saying, I'm gathering that it's more like individual, cannot generalize, but do you feel related to back injuries? Yeah. Do you feel like lighter competitors and heavier competitors struggle different? Like someone heavier, maybe it's lower back and the other one's more cervical because they're getting stacked or upside down a little more?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like a lot of the lower, lighter competitors, you're going to see more. You don't see, you see like more fast guard passing versus heavy smash pass.
Yeah,
more people who are going to invert, versus like you're looking like the big guys, like they're generally going to be more pressure passers. they're generally are not going to have like, like an inverting guard. It's really going to be who gets on top is going to win. I mean, that's just, again, in general, right?
Yeah.
But then there are some people, there are those exceptions of those big guys who can play the small game, and there are small players that can be pressure passers. But yeah, I'd say on average, you're going to see a difference based on the weight classes and then the game that you play.
Okay, so now I have a question for people who are listening to it, and for you, people don't know, I've been promoting events for over 20 years here in Arizona. So now my question is regarding to kids, because we follow the IBJJF rules. So kids, they have like different organizations have different rules. Many times, not many times, but when IBJJF over the years, they've been doing their rules because maybe kids got injured. It's an injury that is happening often. So that's basically how they kind of been making the rules. So when I say kids, it's 15 and under officially at IBJJF. What would you say that it's like, in your opinion, but like mechanically speaking, what would be like a big no-nos? Be like, yeah, I think it'd be better if the kids don't have this specific submissions or moves. Do you feel there are certain positions that it should be avoided? What do you think?
I would probably say jumping guard. Now, obviously, here's the thing: is like it's different kids and adults. There's the medical professional, and then there's the competitor. From a martial art competitor, I think a lot of things should be legal, but obviously, it's kind of like that risk and reward. I think jumping guard, just one of those ones. It's just like, I mean, you could just see those terrible situations people jump guard, and the thing is, like with kids, like let's say someone jumps guard and then they collapse on the person's knee. Depending on how, depending on how old that kid is, like if that kid's still going through puberty, they can't always go get an ACL reconstruction because they're too young. If the surgeon does like an ACL reconstruction while the growth plate's open, it's actually going to damage them. So they have to kind of like do like altered things. It's like I think there was like an EBI. This was like an early EBI. I don't know how long EBI has been around, but like they were having kids matches, but they were like all matches legal. And it was like these two 15-year-old girls, and like someone goes for a heel hook, and it was like one girl got her knee exploded, and then everyone was like, maybe we shouldn't let heel hooks be legal to these kids, it's stuff like that. But I would say that jumping guard would be the big one. I would say for the most part, elbow locks are pretty common injuries, but I would say that they're usually not devastating, right? Because it's like usually like someone applies arm lock, you wait a little bit, it's like pop, 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 pop. So like you have like a few warning signs. Now that first pop might not be devastating. Obviously it's not good, but it's usually like you're in that for a bit before you see those elbow dislocations. You know what I mean?
Yeah. One of the challenges that referees will have, and like this week, we just had a tournament here, and someone was talking with me. I was like, man, I love the refs, but I feel that they're stopping a little too soon. And I understand where they're coming from, but now sometimes get that balance of, because when they stop before, people complain, he didn't tap. And if they hold and they tap and now they're crying, they got hurt, why didn't stop before? So this is something that it kind of happens, but it's something they usually they try to avoid the tap out. And one thing is for sure too, is they don't know their limit, how far is really bad, and by the time they figure it out, it's like pap, pap, pap. I saw a video once of it was an OGI tournament, this kid, and that was like 10 years old or something, 11. It was really bad. It was like they allowed knee bar in this division, and you can see the other kid had no clue what was coming or that even existed. The kid was pulling his leg. He, next thing he's like, ow, something is hurting. I don't even know that I'm supposed to tap to this. So that was really bad. And still having like, coach, chest bumping the kid, it's like, that's kind of brutal.
Yeah, I think obviously, with kids it's a little bit different. Like I think adult and kids have to go by different. I don't have kids, but I understand why people would side more on the safe side with dealing with, kids, just because from like a ref standpoint, like there are people that are double jointed, but the ref doesn't know that you are double jointed versus you're a normal person. So yeah, I'd probably say like be more on the safe side with kids, adults, especially like brown and black belt. Like I think by then, like you kind of know what you're getting into. You know what I mean? So like for those are the people that I would be a little bit more let the athlete kind of decide their injury, right? Like I think a perfect example, I forget, was it Felipe Pena versus Hamala Barral, where I think it was like a semifinal in Worlds. I think it was Pena, and Pena had Barral in a really, really deep ankle lock. Toe hold.
It was Patrick Gaudio, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it was him, Patrick Gaudio. Yeah.
You're right. You're right. Okay. So anyway, Barral gets his ankle dislocated. Everyone's like, "Oh man, he's really stupid." But it's like we have to realize that was the semifinals of Worlds.
Yeah,
he's a black belt. Like he knew exactly what he was doing. He was like, you know what? I want the chance to get a world champion. I'm going to sacrifice my ankle for that. It's one of those things where like he made his decision.
Yeah.
Like, he's not mad at Gaudio for popping his ankle. Like, he knew what was happening. It's like that's a case where it's like let the athlete do what they want to do. Like, for certain tournaments like world champion, ADCC medals, like, it's for history. It just kind of, it's up to the athlete how much they're willing to risk their body.
For sure. In 2015, I had I started like in 2015. I was 14 or 15. I was turning 40, and I have one of those the mid-age crisis, I guess. So I was like, man, I want to try to give it a shot to compete in the adults again and that kind of stuff. And I said, maybe I would like to try to do the adult worlds. And then my incentive was they created those points, those ranking points. So like, I like that because I don't like the idea of if this is the peak of the sport, you can just sign up and kind of go in. You know what I mean? I like the idea of having like, a qualification like they used to have back in Brazil until 2006. You need to have a qualification. 2007, they stopped that when they came to the US. So that was my motivation. Like, okay, I'm going to do a tournament. If I do well, and I feel like I can perform, not necessarily I win, but feel like, can I perform? You know what I mean? I can try. So I end up signing up for one of the opens, Long Beach Open. So I end up doing well, end up winning my division. So it's like, cool, I can try. So I started my like a sequence of tournaments to try to score some points. And I had my old injury that I had already, arthritis in my left elbow because I dislocated before, like a very bad injury. So as I started to travel cut weight and then doing more and more, the arms are getting worse and worse and worse, and got to a point that my last tournament, and it got basically it was a partial tear on my elbow, and I finally got the points to go to the Worlds in 2015. So that was 3 weeks before. So now it's the point that you said, like, the athlete needs to make the choice. So and especially if you're listening at home and you are a competitor, of course, there's always different contexts, but if you had this goal and you set all this, and as soon as you get there, like this injury here, you can go, but if you go, it may get worse. You know what I mean? So you need to make the choice. So at that moment, I said, like, from what I've been through for the past 7 to 8 months, like, I am willing to take the risk and actually compete. So I could not roll the 2 weeks before the tournament. It was just a lot of drilling, some swimming. It was really inflamed. It was really bad. So anyway, I ended up winning my first match. I didn't feel my arm. It was okay. And then a second match, in the first minute, I felt a little shift. I was going with GT Torres. I felt a little shift, a light one. I was like, ooh, something happened. But I kept going. And then, so he passed my guard. I'm trying to turn all fours, and my elbow just went like, wow, just out. So that was really bad. This one ended up having a surgery that they get that part of the tendon in the wrist and put in the elbow.
Tommy
What's that?
John.
Yeah, Tommy John. Yeah. So I did that one. So that was intense. I never had anything that was a full year. I tried to get back within 10 months and I was not ready. Like I felt like training. I was like, dude, yeah, I felt weird. Like this is not ready. So then this happened. But then so I made that decision of, okay, I don't regret. Now this year I was signed up for the Master Worlds in about 3 weeks before. I was already doing physical therapy because I started feeling my knee 4 months ago, like that little thing, like, it's bothering me, but I can't train. So since I'm older and know better, like I better start training right now, because as I pick up training, this is going to get worse. And then start getting a little worse. And then finally 3 weeks before the tournament, I got up from training and I'm like, oh, something happens. And then next day I got an MRI. So I torn my meniscus. Okay. So on this specific situation, I'm like, this context does not motivate. Can I compete? Sure. I mean, yeah, I wasn't going to be able to train at that time or whatever. I could just really go for it, but like, it's not going to prove me anything. The context was very different than the other one. So I'm not willing to take this simple surgery that can get a lot more complicated. With that said, talking about meniscus, of course every situation is different. So how do you feel? I think this is a big topic. How do you feel about the meniscus injury, as far as when they say like the longer recovery, you just cut it a piece of it? So what's your opinion on meniscus tears?
Well, okay, so first we have to think about whether surgery is warranted versus not. Now, anytime there's a surgery, I think it is a good idea to get multiple opinions, because there's certain surgeons that are like a little surgery happy. Like, you have to think that every medical professional has a certain bias. I'm a physical therapist. I'm going to side with the more conservative approach first. Surgeons want to do surgery, right? So it's good to get a second opinion just to make sure it's something that needs surgery versus rehab. When it comes to a meniscus, the big thing that I'm looking for would be locking and catching. So if, like, let's say you're like, my knee doesn't move, like it's literally, there's like something blocked. That'd be like a bucket handle tear. Like, that's a surgery thing. You can't rehab that. There's certain things you have to be careful of, like a root tear, where if the meniscus is torn at the root, if they just trim that, it's like you have no meniscus. So it's one of those things, like, you want to take that really seriously, and you do want to get that addressed. You don't want to ignore it. So first you want to see, again, are you that person? Because there's a lot of people that, like, you've been doing jiu-jitsu a long time. You could have had more of a degenerated meniscus, meaning like it wasn't like your knee tore because you did something. It was just like you do jiu-jitsu over and over again. Like, that's something where it's like, well, maybe you try to rehab that, versus like, let's say, like you're in, you kind of like force a knee slice pass, knee pops, like that's more of an acute tear. That's kind of like sometime where I might say, okay, maybe we do surgery. So now it comes to, let's say they decide they want to do surgery. It's first the meniscectomy, where they trim it, versus the repair, where they try to save it. Now, the idea is that the meniscus has a poor blood supply depending on where it is. So the outside of the meniscus tends to have a little bit better blood flow. The inside tends to have poor blood flow, meaning that they can repair it, but doesn't mean it's actually going to heal. So what I usually say is, if a surgeon recommends repairing, I would usually say go for it. Now, I know that's harder because the rehab's slower from the beginning. Sometimes you're non-weight bearing for 6 weeks. It might be a few months, like 6 months before you're getting back, versus a meniscectomy. Like, if they just trim it, you can be back to jiu-jitsu in like a month, right? So it's kind of like the short-term versus long-term, but then it's also like, how long do you want to be able to do jiu-jitsu? So a competitor will use like Nicky Ryan, because I talked about him. He's like an 18-year-old kid. He tore his meniscus. And he was like, I think he posted something. He's like, I don't know if I want to get the repair. And I'm like, dude, you should get the repair, because he's 19. Like, he can be doing jiu-jitsu competitively until his like mid-30s, right? So like, for him, like, why do we try to maintain that for as long as possible? And I use his coach as an example. Like, what do you think John Danaher would do if he had the option to not need a knee replacement, right? Because John Danaher has got a deformed knee. They did a surgery when he was a kid. surgery in New Zealand, like in the 80s, wasn't great. So essentially his knee's deformed and he has severe arthritis, and he's like John Danaher doesn't roll anymore because of his knee. Like, what do you think he would give to be able to just train? You know what I mean? So I do think it is important to look at longevity. And then if you also look at like competitive jiu-jitsu, like you're 47 and still competing in masters, like there's people, like there's masters 7, like you can do competition some capacity, you know, like, is it as cool winning master 7 as it is adult? No, but like, I don't know you, but like, I think I would like to be able to do jiu-jitsu like as long as Helio Gracie. Like he was doing jiu-jitsu in some capacity in his 90s. Again, he's not rolling with these young guys, but he's doing jiu-jitsu. And for me, that's what I want. So if you can preserve your knee, I would usually recommend that. Again, if it's an option, if the surgeon thinks that he can do the repair.
Now, still on the knee topic, what about for people who have ACL issues, and when they say like, hey, you're going to remove the ACL, you're going to repair? What's your view on that? And of course, every case is different, but do you, a lot of people are okay with staying without the ACL, but for jiu-jitsu, what do you think?
So it's not necessarily the sport of jiu-jitsu, it's like the person. So there's, and there is no reason why. It just, there's some people that are classified as copers, and there's some that are non-copers. There's some people, they have no ACL and like they're complete, like literally they can't even walk because their knees is sliding all over the place. But then there's some people, and I'm sure you know, there's like, you know, there's professional athletes, jiu-jitsu guys right now that have no ACL and you would never know, right? So and there's some certain criteria for seeing if you are a coper. That's why what they're doing now is if someone has an ACL tear, they send them to physical therapy first. One, the idea is we want to get rid of the swelling. We want to get the swelling down. We want to get your range of motion as good as possible, even if you need surgery. But then there's a chance that there's some people that, again, like they're like, my knee's good, like I don't need it. Like I was working with this one guy, he was a police officer. Like he literally could run, jump, roll, like you would have no idea he didn't have an ACL, but on the MRI reports, there's no ACL. So again, that's not everybody. Some people are copers. Let's say you're not a coper. You know, ACL reconstruction is tough. Generally, when they say reconstruction, it's because it's very rare for them to do an ACL repair where they take the remaining ACL and they try to stitch it. The outcomes aren't great. There's some surgeons that are able to make it work, but it really depends on where the tear is. So if the ACL tear is like from the bone, sometimes that's potential. But if it tears in the middle, which is usual, they have to reconstruct it. ACL reconstruction is rough because you're going to get to this point where usually around like 4 months when you're doing strength conditioning, like I feel pretty good, like my knee's moving good, I'm strong, I think I can go back to jiu-jitsu. But that ligament isn't ready for stress. You know, like if you look at some of the literature, it can take up to 2 years for your ligament, so the new ligament, to gain the same resiliency it had before injury. Now, a lot of times, like if you tell an athlete 2 years before getting back to jiu-jitsu, like nobody's going to take it, which is why the return to sport right now is about 9 months. And the reason why they do 9 months is early on, they had people going back to their sport at 6 months, but then the re-tear rates were really, really high. I think for every month after 6 months that you wait to go back, like your re-tear rate drops like 50%. It's pretty significant. And I think about nine months is when the re-tear rates are fairly level. So like waiting longer isn't necessarily better. Now we can kind of like fast forward and we can talk about jiu-jitsu specifics. Again, it depends on your game. So a lot of knee injuries actually happen from like the scramble and the takedown. So if you're more of a top player, you're more of like a quick, you know, takedown guy, you're going to have more of like a Toriano style guard passing. Like those people, like they might benefit a little bit better from having an ACL, right? Because they have this side to side motion. You need to be able to change direction fast, you know, especially if you're like a knee slice passer. Like knee slice is just one where sometimes people get a little overzealous, like their knees are tangled and they just keep going, you know, versus like potentially if you're more of like a guard player where like really like the ACL does, like if you're playing open guard, doesn't really matter, right? Because the ACL isn't going to be stressed with a lot of things that you're doing. So they're someone where, again, based on their style, like they might be able to get away with it. You know, like I think Eason Creaseworth, what's his name? The Danaher guy? Yeah.
Wait, I thought you were gonna say the therapist. No, I don't know if I know who we're talking about.
He's one of the Danaher guys out of Montreal. Anyway, he just had an ACL surgery, but I think he reported that he had like a ACL tear for 3 years, and he was fine. But he ended up getting the surgery recently. So it's again, like there's people out there that like are fine with no ACL just based on what they do. You know, I think he started talking recently because the Danaher guys are getting into more wrestling. I think lately he might have decided to get the surgery because like now that he's wrestling, like the lack of ACL is a little bit more apparent. You know what I mean?
Got it. And the last question regarding to knees. If you want to share with us mechanically what is happening, and if you see a lot, because I've seen lockdown injury from the other person, you know, like getting out of it. It's most of the time it leads to ACL.
Yeah. So a lot of times, like with those knee injuries, it's like a forced rotation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's again like with something like the lockdown, like your knee is essentially like they get the lockdown and your knee is rotated, and then they straighten the knee. And what's really happening is the person on top is like they're fighting it. So like their knee's in a bad position, and they try to like just disregard. They try to like force through. That's the problem. So if someone has a lockdown, you kind of have to like respect it. Like I might concede the position a little bit so that I can bring my heel to my butt and you swivel your hips and then you can kind of get out. Like, I mean, the lockdown is one of those things, like if you know how to get out of it, it's actually not that hard. It's the people who don't realize and don't respect it. But I think that's everything. It's like with a leg lock, like in my opinion, leg locks are very safe if you understand when you're in danger and when you're not. It's the people that just, they treat it like a straight ankle lock. They're like, well, I'm just going to tough it out. That's when they have the problem.
True.
Is when they just kind of like, they just don't tap because they're waiting for something to pop. But the problem is it's not necessarily something small. There goes your ACL. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I have just one more question here, kind of back to the kids. So one of the submissions that it's not allowed in the IBJJF for kids is omoplata. And talking with some even IBJJF refs, they say like, man, I don't know why omoplata is not allowed, because I see a lot more injuries from Kimura than anything. You know what I mean? Kids get really stretched out or whatever, but still a submission. So do you see much difference, mechanically speaking, from omoplatas and Kimura? Like, no, this one is too dangerous and this one is okay.
No, I think it's exactly the same. Yeah. The only thing is like the omoplata is like a sweep first, submission second. So it could be that people are like trying to like fight the sweep. So it's like, it's almost like the athlete doesn't recognize the danger because they're like, well, I don't want to get swept, so I'm going to fight it. But from a mechanical standpoint, I think it's exactly the same. I mean, I know that there's some instructors that would argue that the Kimura is a deadlier or a more dangerous submission than like a heel hook. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because it can really yank it. At least omoplata is going to be a slow process for the most part.
Yeah. I mean, also to think too, like from a technical aspect, like how many people do you know that have like a really good omoplata submission? Like it's not that many, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, again, it's more of like a high percentage sweep, but like I know very few people that have like the omoplata where they're actually like submitting people. So I mean, I don't really see there to be any danger more than a Kimura. So if a Kimura is legal, I think that the omoplata should be legal.
There we go. Now let's kind of shift gear here. Let's talk a little bit about entrepreneurship and how is for you when you decided to kind of go in and pursue this, this field. What are some of the troubles that I have during your journey to make this happen as an entrepreneur?
I think the biggest thing is one, because jiu-jitsu for the most part is like an amateur sport. Like now people are starting to get paid, but for years, like you're not getting money doing jiu-jitsu. And that's why a lot of people go to mixed martial arts. So a lot of these jiu-jitsu athletes have no money. Second, because they have no money, they don't actually realize the importance of medical care. Again, like let's say just like we talked about before, is they have an injury, they go to their physician, the physician said, okay, you should stop jiu-jitsu. So like, why would I pay money to go see this guy who's gonna tell me to not do the thing that I, you know what I mean? Like, so I think that that's the issue, is there's so many athletes that don't reach out for care when they should, because let's say you have an injury that, like, you just pop your elbow. What if we can get that elbow 100% so we don't let it become a chronic injury, right? But usually it's like with most things that they have an elbow injury, it gets popped, it pops again. Now they're starting to have more lingering issues, but like this issue is like a 3-year-old issue. If I could have got it early on, it never would be an issue. So it's more, the hardest thing that I have is educating the athlete to know that physical therapy would be beneficial for them, and that it's like they should do it. Like, again, even though there's a financial cost to them, that it's overall, it's going to help their long-term performance and longevity in the sport.
I don't know. And what's your vision that you have for your brand, for your business on a few years? Where, like, what's some of like the big visions that you have for your business?
So I think that I would, right now I see a mix of people. Like, I don't just see jiu-jitsu athletes. Like, it would be very cool if I could have a clinic where all I saw was combat athletes. I think that would be really cool. I mean, in general, I like working with anybody with a goal. Like, it doesn't matter. And an athlete, whether it's baseball, football, whatever, like, they have a goal. But it's just like, when it comes to a sport, like, I don't watch baseball or football. Like, I just don't care. But like jiu-jitsu, I watch. Like, I like jiu-jitsu. I like mixed martial arts. I like kickboxing. I like wrestling. So it's something where I feel that, again, like I said, like, I have this unique ability to work with them. And, there are some physical therapists that get burnt out. So there's some people that they'll work with athletes, but they're not necessarily on top of physical therapy. It's like you take jiu-jitsu. Like, jiu-jitsu is way different than it was 15 years ago. So if you have someone who trains like it's 15 years ago, like, their technique might not be good. Same with physical therapy. Like, the field
continue education, right?
Exactly. Like, it grows, it changes, So like, I'm a nerdy guy. Like, I stay on top of this stuff. Like, I'm trying to be as good as I can. So I think it'd be really cool if I could work with these athletes full time. I'm starting to work on some digital products. The tricky with digital products is just the fact where the general advice is, if someone's injury, like, I can't really answer the question without an assessment. Like, you could say, my elbow hurts, I don't know what to do, without the assessment. And that's usually why a lot of physicians will give that, like, very basic advice. We'll rest it and ice it, because they're like, okay, well, ice is good for pain. Resting means you're going to avoid making it worse. But for real, like, if I really want to help your elbow, like, I'm like, all right, well, let's see how it moves. Like, what's the problem? Is it not bending? Is it not straightening? What tissue is limiting you from doing those things? So but that being said, even if I can't give an assessment, I can still help. So I do have some products out there. So I do something called Kin Stretch, which is like a body and joint maintenance program. I kind of build into, like, why it's useful for jiu-jitsu. So currently I have one for the legs. I just released one for the upper extremity. So elbows, fingers are big jiu-jitsu. The next one I'm going to do is spine. So essentially how I can work on improving someone's spine. I've been kind of toying around with the idea for doing like a BJJ Fanatics video on like how to return to the mat. I just want to make sure that, like, that's an idea that people are interested in. Like, you have an injury, now how do you get back to jiu-jitsu, right? Like, if I can't be their physical therapist, how can I at least give them the information, or they can give the information to their physical therapist? Because I've had people reach out to me, they're like, look, the PT here is fine, but they don't understand jiu-jitsu, so they don't know what you need to get back to. So, but again, there's a lot of what ifs, because I have to figure out like how I can make it work. And, I have to make sure that the athlete realizes the importance of what I'm doing, right?
Yeah. And just go ahead.
Yeah. So those are some things that I'm kind of thinking about in the future, about things I want to work on and where I want to be.
Yeah. And just give you props too, that I've heard, about your work from 2 or 3 people, and everyone that mentioned said that you're very approachable and responsive on Instagram, which is really cool, that it really helps, like your brand and getting the word out. So back to physical therapy, because you said something interesting about the continuing education, right? Like no matter what area you at, continuing education. So do you feel there anything that comes to your mind, like a huge change that maybe 10 years ago people used to treat a certain way and now is different? Is there anything that pops to your mind, like any major changes, 10, 15 years ago?
I would say a big thing is the approach of modality-based physical therapy versus active. So, the very classic like image of physical therapy is like you go into physical therapy, they give you a hot pack, and then they do some ultrasound, which is like this gel thing, and then you do like an exercise or two, and then they give you some ice with stim. And like that's what people think physical therapy is, which in my opinion, that is not what physical therapy is. A lot of modalities have a purpose for temporarily reducing pain, but essentially what they're doing is they're addressing the symptoms, not the cause. So someone comes with a knee injury, you do all that stuff. You didn't do anything to help the knee. Like you're not helping the knee heal. You're not helping getting the range of motion back. You're just making the pain go down. So from like a physical therapy standpoint, I acknowledge pain, but I don't treat pain. Like something might hurt and I keep that in mind, but I really focus on the function. Okay, let's get that mobility back. Let's making that joint move the way it's supposed to. Let's getting it stronger and more stable, because when that happens, pain goes down. So if you just like, I'm really addressing the cause. So I think that more active approach is important, and like people, like they look at what is the best athlete doing, right? And they're like, okay, well, they look at the UFC Performance Institute and they see that the UFC Performance Institute has like all this stuff. You don't realize like the best thing at the UFC Performance Institute is the fact that you have, a head physical therapist who's been working with athletes for 15 years. Like her expertise is the good thing, not the fact that they have light and laser and all that stuff. Like that's extra, right? So it's like if you have somebody who like they want to get good at jiu-jitsu, but they're not actually doing jiu-jitsu. Like at the end of the day, if you want to get good at jiu-jitsu, you got to be on the mats, right? So
yeah,
if you want to get something better from a rehab standpoint, there's this concept called mechanotherapy, meaning that you do appropriate stress to the tissue, which helps it heal. Because if you think about it, healing and strength conditioning are the same thing. They're just on different spectrums, right? So versus is the tissue that's injured, is it ready to handle certain load? And if it's not, you got to do what it can handle. Versus now the tissue has the adequate resilience. Well, how can we stress it to make it stronger and better, right? So it's all on the same thing. So I think that active approach to physical therapy is really the way to go. Now,
long term, right? Basically, yeah.
And I'm not saying you can't use modalities if it helps decrease pain, fine. If it allows you to do the things that are important. But if you are only doing the stuff that reduces pain, you're never going to get better.
Got it. And what about, that's a common question that people have with regarding to ice and heat treatment and when it would be, I don't know, suitable. I don't know.
So essentially there's two different mechanisms of how they work. So what ice does is ice blocks the pain signal from the injured site to your brain. So it never gets there, which is why it's good for pain. Clinically, I don't really find that ice is great for swelling. If someone has a swelling, I would prefer compression. Heat, what it does is it kind of makes the tissue a little bit more pliable. So if it's painful because it's stiff, it gets it moving better. And that's where it feels better. But again, when it comes to heat, would it be better for you to just do a warm-up, or do you need the application of heat, right? So clinically, what I do is I kind of look at the athlete. If they have resting pain, meaning like you're just sitting here and your knee or your elbow is just aching, that's someone where I might give them ice. But then you also have to look at the physiological aspect of what does ice do? Well, ice blunts the inflammation response, but that inflammation response is needed for healing. So, and there's actually a lot of literature on this, where if you look at like when people do strength training, and then if they immediately jump into like an ice bath, you just stop to the change of, because again, when you do strength training, you stress your body. In the adaptation, it gets stronger. So if you stop the initial stress effect, you won't get the adaptation. Same with healing, right? So it kind of depends on the person. But you have to also look at, like, let's say like someone had surgery, like, so if you had ACL surgery, I don't think you're going to get back to jiu-jitsu for several months. I'm going to deal with the pain early on because I don't feel like it's really going to delay healing enough.
Okay.
You know, again, heat and ice. If there is an active inflammation, like it's swollen, adding heat isn't necessarily going to make it better because maybe you're adding more fluid to the area. So like I said, kind of listen to your body. If you have a high resting pain, that's where I'd consider icing. Me personally, I don't like icing my body. Like, I just don't feel like ice is beneficial for me. Some people, it's very beneficial. So there is that psychological component as well. Like, some people really like it. Some people like the fact that they can do something for their pain. So those are someone, like, when I identified that, like, I would rather you ice so you at least can control your pain versus you're like, man, like every time I do everything, like everything's hurting. It's not getting better because, again, you're focusing more on the pain. If I get that pain down, sometimes people feel like they're getting better. And that's usually why that older model of physical therapy, people would keep going back because they go and like, oh, I feel good. It just lasts a short period of time, but then they keep going back.
How do you feel about cryotherapy?
So what I would say is it depends on how you want to use it. So if you are going to do like a technical, like, so if you're training today and you're like, today was more about like training your skills, but now you're sore, cryotherapy can be beneficial. But there's some training sessions, whether it's strength and conditioning or like, you're like, all I'm going to do is just roll today because I want to work on my cardio. Potentially, if you ice immediately after, like you do that type of training, or you do like a heavy strength and conditioning program, you know, like, again, you might be blunting the response you need for adaptation. I think if I remember the literature, I think there's like a 4 to 6 hour window. So if like you were going to ice, you got to wait at least 6 hours. Some people love that cryotherapy. Some people don't. From a physiological standpoint, it feels good because you're kind of shocking your body. And then people will take that sensation and they'll feel like they're recovering. So if you're going to do it, wait a few hours. You know, that's kind of what I'd say with that.
Cool. Now we're getting close to the end of the interview. I want to ask you too, besides all the information that you study in physical therapy in the medical field, what else do you like to consume? Any, if you read books or audiobooks or podcasts in different topics from that, and what do you like?
From a non-physical therapy standpoint, so I do a fair amount of reading at night. So I feel like one of the things, especially with our culture, we kind of get too addicted to electronic tech. So I like to like read books, usually at night, to help me wind down. I'll read more fiction. So I'll do like a lot of science fiction. From like a non, like fiction standpoint, I do enjoy like books on leadership. I got into them because I started following Jocko, and he's my hero. And then even though, I'm not in a leadership role right now, I do find it really, really fascinating because at the end of the day, at some point, everyone's going to be a leader in some capacity, whether it's
absolutely at home or whatever. Yeah.
Or home. So, because if you think about it, it's just how to deal with people. It's funny. I got a degree in psychology, and people are like, oh, that's useful. It's like dealing with people. I'm like, I really didn't learn that in school. Like, I learned that more from this leadership stuff that I read, so those are some of the things that I enjoy. I go back and forth with business. I think that's a common thing with entrepreneurs. Like you pick whatever your topic is, whether it's physical therapy, jiu-jitsu, whatever, and people want to do something. I'm sure you know a lot of gym owners that are like, well, what do I do? I like doing jiu-jitsu. I'll open a gym, but they have no concept of how to run a business. Right. And that's why there's some people that like, they might be mediocre at jiu-jitsu, but they know how to run a business, so they can still have a successful business, versus those world champions that they're awesome at jiu-jitsu, but they can't run a business whatsoever. So I think doing business education is really important too. In whatever capacity, whether it's something small, like, like for me, like, my digital products versus like something big, like opening a gym, opening a clinic, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned about, because essentially you teach jiu-jitsu, kind of living the dream, right? Supposedly I can just train and teach, it's all good, and people don't realize what it's like behind to like actually get people through the door
Exactly.
keep them there and pay your bills and pay eventually if you have employees. Do you know who Gary Vaynerchuk is?
Yeah.
Gary V. For people not familiar with him, just check him out at Gary V, VEE. So I've got a lot of good stuff from digital marketing with him and really good tips. I think I started following him in 2014. I don't follow as much as I used to, but I got some great concepts with him. So one of them that I never actually forgot, he said something like, there are people who have the entrepreneurial tendencies and some people have entrepreneurial DNA. So the difference is the entrepreneurial tendencies is people like, dude, that would be pretty sweet if I have my business. I'll have make my own hours and all that stuff. But as soon, and if it doesn't go well, they'll be like, I can always go back to whatever I was doing. And doesn't work, it's okay. So we have the tendency, but it said like, when you have an entrepreneurial DNA, you fail, you break, you do another business. You fail, you break, you just don't know, but it's just the way you're wired, you know? So I think it's very important people to like try to distinguish, do I have that? I'm wired like with a DNA that's all you think. Since I was a kid, I was always kind of like related this way, you know, having more an entrepreneurial mind, selling things when I was a kid. That was something that it came natural to me. I never really pay attention. It's not like I know what an entrepreneur is. So I'm pretty positive that I in the spectrum, I'm definitely more into the DNA, but I think it's important people get to know like, okay, is that what you really want? Is that how you're wired? And a lot of people can really develop and improve too, you know, if they have more tendencies. And, you know, I feel that people can definitely improve. Something else you mentioned about the books that is very interesting about how you read fiction at night. The first time I heard of people doing this many years ago, listened to Tim Ferriss. And then he said that I listen or read fiction at night because if I get any content, activates my mind and it's on. And I'm the same way. If you start adding content, I'm like, oh shit, so I can do this, I can do that, you know, and it goes bad. So this is a great way, it's a great time to read fiction. But man, I appreciate your time. Like there's a lot of good information. I really hope, especially people who are listening, if you know anyone who are dealing with certain injuries, certain things that we talked about, make sure to forward this video or this audio. If you're watching this, I started to release not too long ago on YouTube. I always did mainly audio, but I started a few episodes ago, put on YouTube. So forward this video to someone, forward the audio, probably even listen again, because there's a lot of good tips. And you can also, as I mentioned, Mike has been very responsive from what I've heard, you know, that people can contact you at Dr._Kickass on Instagram. Anything else that you want to plug, Mike?
So, like I said, 2 digital products right now, King Stress for Jiu-Jitsu, upper extremity, lower extremity. The next product is going to be spine. Essentially, it's a body maintenance, joint health, how to optimize your body specifically for jiu-jitsu. It's a combination of mobility, joint practice, strengthening. Again, it's, in my clinical opinion, I think it's the perfect complement to jiu-jitsu. If you're that person who you are that recreational athlete who wants to maintain your body for jiu-jitsu, or even if you're that competitor who's looking for that edge, like you want more hip mobility so you can play better guard, that stuff's going to be beneficial. I'm currently trying to get a research project with the therapist Ethan Christworth. We're co-writing a research project on the safety of heel hooks with the addition to, you know, now that it's legal in IBJF. So we just went through one big step. So hopefully we can get that paper done and published this year. So I'm really excited about that because I'm a science nerd, but you know, pay attention to that. I think it's going to be cool. So those are the main things.
And Ethan has been on a podcast too before, so sharing his knowledge. So that was really cool. So Mike, and one more time, thank you so much. Guys, have any questions, can always send me a message. I see you all soon. Thanks
for having me.